So the whole tradition of Deuteronomy is to remember Pharaoh's Egypt and to think how to construct a political economy that is in contrast to Pharaoh's political economy, in which the producers are the ones that get ahead and get all the benefits and all the advantages. So Deuteronomy begins to imagine a political economy in which the community shares the resources for all of its members. So I give you three of the texts in this cluster and then two derivative texts. Three times in the book of Deuteronomy, in addition to Deuteronomy 5, there is a commandment given by Moses in the 6th century, presumably. That is the question of the book of Deuteronomy is, how do you create a covenantal community that is totally in contrast with the political economy of the empire? And the foundation of that is to remember that you used to be slaves, but you're not slaves now, so quit acting like slaves. In Deuteronomy 16:12, this Deuteronomy 16 is the calendar of the three great festivals that are to be celebrated. The Festival of Weeks, and the Festival of Booths, and the Festival of Passover. And in 16:12, it imagines that the third of these feasts is to be a great food festival. And the food is to be shared with widows, orphans, and immigrants. Sometimes that's translated immigrants, sometimes it's translated sojourner, sometimes it's translated alien. It's people who don't belong here. We know what the word immigrant means. So that the commandment has in purview the outsiders to the economy that have not produced anything but are entitled to the benefits of the economy. And then the commandment ends by saying, you shall remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That's the motivation for all of this inclusive hospitality. In Deuteronomy 24:18, there is a provision for making loans. And it says if you make a loan to a poor person that has only one coat, you cannot take that one coat as collateral for the loan because they need the coat. You can pick it up and keep it as collateral during the day, but you got to take it back to them at night so they can sleep in it and stay warm, and then you can pick it up if it's collateral. Can you imagine doing that with a 30-year loan? Pick it up and then it says, you shall remember that you were slaves in Egypt. And then at the end of Deuteronomy 24, this is an extraordinary provision. It says when you harvest your grain, don't go back in the field and pick up what you dropped. Leave it for the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. When you pick your grapes, don't go back and pick up what you left. Leave it for the widow, the orphan, and the immigrant. When you pick your olives, don't go back and pick up the olives you missed. Leave it for the widow, the orphan. So it's three times for the widow, the orphan, the immigrant. And that whole cluster of provisions ends by saying, remember, you were slaves. So Sabbath, in Deuteronomy 5, it seems to me, becomes an opportunity to rethink the political economy and to rethink the resources of the community that are to be to the benefit of the entire community. And restfulness in this tradition, it seems to me, is to have created the possibility of genuine neighborliness. Because Pharaoh's system, without Sabbath, could not generate neighborliness. So this is in contrast all the way down. Now, two derivative texts, and these are the only ones I can think of in this cluster. There may be some others. I grew up in a very small town. My father was a pastor. And in that town, there were two churches, our church and the Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. And there were two grocery stores that were open after church. The problem for the grocery stores is that the Lutheran church got out 15 minutes earlier than our church. So before our church got out, the Lutherans were all gathered at the grocery store waiting. And I can remember as a kid, Mr. and Mrs. Gottenstrater, this is a very German community, Mr. and Mrs. Gottenstrater owned one of those two stores, and they always sat in the front pew. I don't know why they did that. At 10 minutes to 12, usually before the sermon was done, and certainly before the offering, because we used to take the offering then, they got up and prayed down the aisle and went out because they had to go help the Lutherans buy groceries. They didn't want to miss the business. So in Amos 8, this is the only early text that I could identify, 8:4, hear this, you that trample the needy, that bring to ruin the poor of the land, you who say, quote, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain? And when will the Sabbath be over so that we can sell wheat? When will this religious holiday be over so that we can rig false scales to cheat poor people and buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals and selling the sweepings of the wheat? You ever have that experience of waiting for Sunday to be over so you get back to doing what you do that valorizes your life? Good, a big yawn and a big look at the watch. So Sabbath is, and in this society apparently is an enforced break in work, but it is not a welcome break in work, because I'd rather do this. I had a little eye surgery this week, and I had to go in on Saturday to have my doctor check my little eye surgery. And I said to him on Sabbath, do you ever stop working? And Dr. Bell said, he's a terrific doctor, he said, I love working. He also told me that when he was in school in Ohio State, his teacher that taught him surgery said, now pay attention, because if you pay attention, I can teach an orangutan to do surgery. That's what he said. I said, thank you very much. So I don't know whether Dr. Bell does Sabbath, but obviously Amos's contemporaries regarded Sabbath as an unhappy interruption of their chance to make money out of exploiting poor people. So it's a critique of a certain political economy. And the other text in this cluster that I want to mention, which I think is a really interesting text, in Isaiah 56, this is after they have come back from exile, and they're having a debate about who will be included in the community. You know, Episcopalians have recently had that debate about who are the real reliable Episcopalians and who needs to be not recognized and all that kind of stuff. So apparently they had an argument about whether you could admit eunuchs, because eunuchs were people who had their sexuality fixed so they could serve Babylonian overlords. And they had a debate about whether we can let foreigners in. This is a wonderful text because it's welcoming. He says, 56:4, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath and choose the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, they are welcome. And to the foreigners who keep my Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast to my covenant, they are welcome. And this is the text that culminates in the line that Jesus quotes, that my house, meaning the Jerusalem temple, will be a house of prayer for all peoples. So it's an incredibly inclusive vision. But what strikes me about the decision they made, according to this poetry, that there is a generic requirement that if you want in, you got to keep covenant. But the only specific requirement that is mentioned is the keeping of Sabbath. That is the mark of Jewishness, whereby their children could see that their lives are not defined by the busyness of production and acquisitiveness. When I think about that, they could have said something about adultery or false witness or killing or stealing or lying. They didn't. And when I think about that, it gives me chill bumps to think that's the only marker that is non-negotiable for this community. Because this community that keeps Sabbath practices its time and its energy different from the imperial system that is all around it. Now, you could extrapolate to say that the reason they could do that is that they believed in the abundance of God's creation, so you don't have to hustle all the time. Whereas Pharaoh's system is built on a premise of scarcity. There's not enough, so you better get yours. So that's the second model. I think you can relate the model of creation and economic emancipation, but they really are developed in quite different directions. So let me stop there to see whether you have a comment or a question you'd like to pursue any of this. Yes?
The comment about this necessarily acquiring things does ring true to me when you consider that Jesus spoke most about wealth.
Yep.
Is that correct? I mean, of all the topics he...
That's what Tony Campbell says, and I think he's counted them and I haven't. So,
So that rings true, and that
Yep.
seems to match
Yep.
what Jesus was teaching.
I recently wrote a review of a very complex book, since you mentioned that, by Peter Brown, who's a great historian. And he studies what happened to the church in the 4th century. You all know about Constantinianism, in which we say that the church signed on to power. Peter Brown says Constantine didn't do that. He was a good guy. And the church, even under Constantine, used its resources to care for the poor. Peter Brown has written another book in which he says the early Christian bishops invented the social category of the poor. They had not been noticed. But Brown says in the 2 generations after Constantine, what happened is that wealthy people joined the church. His thesis is it was wealthy people, not Constantine, that required Constantinianism. And he says that in the 5th and 6th century, what happened is that the energy of the church got pulled away from the poor and became devoted to the afterlife, so that the wealthy prepared a place for themselves. And he says it's in that period that the priests became holy men. They were given different kind of haircuts, and they were put in priestly robes, but not until then, because he says the new wealthy constituency of the church wanted religion to be compartmentalized away from the political economy and the care for the poor. Now, I don't know if that's right, but Peter Brown is probably the greatest historian we have, and he goes tediously through all of these incredible documents and all that. And the major church figures, Peter Brown identifies Augustine as the one who approved this move, because Augustine wanted to make it work all right for people. In in contrast to Jerome and Ambrose, says he. So it's a very hard book, but you might be interested in anything written about this period by Peter Brown. So the wealth business keeps coming up, and if you look at the quotations of Jesus, there is no doubt that Jesus is a child of Deuteronomy, which is kind of the main interpretive tradition that led to rabbinic Judaism. So Jesus knows this text and this critique of all of that, I think, out of that tradition. So thank you for that. Well, yes?
How do you think that the Sabbath practice resonates in a society today where the greatest value is job creation?
Well, I have the impression that the greatest value was job creation. It may ought to be, but I have the impression that it was. I don't see anybody doing anything about job creation. Well, I think desperately unemployed people would be glad for a job if it were on Sabbath or whenever. I think that's surely right. And then I think that one may well have recourse to Jesus' teaching in the Gospel of Mark that the Sabbath that man wasn't made for the Sabbath. Man, humankind, was not created to keep Sabbath, but the Sabbath was created in order to enhance the human condition. And apparently by Jesus' time they sort of got that backward, and Sabbath had itself become a coercive practice. Yeah. Yes?
If you are enslaved in that pharaonic economy that feeds more and more and more, how do you practically observe your Sabbath with slave masters who don't want you to do that?
I think the way the book of Exodus works, for the sake of Sabbath, we need to depart Pharaoh's regime. We need, in the ways we are able, to quit cooperating with the system of acquisitiveness. And I suppose that's by needing less, or wanting less, or not watching television commercials that create more hungers for us, and so on and so on. I think it calls for a reorganization of our desire system. Say more.
A mundane question. What's the relative chronology of these texts? The real chronology? Do we know?
No, scholars are now thinking that most of the generative texts in the Old Testament cluster in the 6th century under Babylon or in the 5th century under Persia. That isn't very precise, but in the last 50 years, there has been a kind of a scholarly consensus on pulling all the texts later, when self-conscious Jewishness really became important. That probably is also when you get all of the text in the book of Leviticus about being holy. They were asking about how do Jews order their life so they're different from the political economy around them.
Whether Exodus preceded Deuteronomy or not, that's putting it fine.
Well, if you go by content, there must have been some version of the Exodus story that was prior to the book of Deuteronomy. Whether it's our book of Exodus or not, that's a different kind of question. Yeah. Okay, I want to talk about the third cluster of texts. And I want to suggest that the creation text and the Exodus texts converge in interpretation to talk about Sabbatic principle. I got that phrase from Patrick Miller, who is retired from Princeton Seminary. As they thought about 7 days, they began to imagine that covenantal time is organized in sevens. So they talked about 7 years. And in Deuteronomy 15, 1 to 18, you get a teaching by Moses called the Year of Release. And it is the release of debts. It is the cancellation of debts, particularly on poor people. And so probably this practice that is proposed is derivative from Sabbath, so this is Sabbath writ large. So I want to tell you several things about this quite amazing text. It concludes 18 verses, maybe 16 verses in. It concludes this whole program by saying, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the argument is that the Exodus had God redeem Israel from its debt to Pharaoh. So redemption, as you know, is an economic term. So when we sing, I praise the Redeemer Creator, or even if you name a church after it, the word is an economic word, which means being bought out of debt slavery. And what we know at the end of the book of Genesis is these people in the book of Exodus are in slavery because they didn't have any food and they didn't have any money to buy food, and so they had to give their bodies over to Pharaoh in order to get food. That's how they paid their debt. And the metaphor of the narrative then is that God paid for that, and then that gets carried into Christological language about Christ paid the debt for our sins, and that's not the way Episcopalians talk, but that language is around. So the second thing that I want to say is that in this text is the text that Jesus quotes by saying there will always be poor people. Now the way that is often understood by us is, well, what the hell, there's no use doing anything, there'll always be poor people. But that's not how the statement functions. The statement functions by saying, you really have to do this because there are always poor people that need you to do it. And then it says, if you do it, poverty will end. So the cancellation of debts promises that you can put an end to this economic disparity. And so it's really urgent, and you can tell that the teaching evoked resistance because Moses says, do not be hard-hearted and tight-fisted. I know in that verse it talks that way about that. Apparently what the text imagines is that people didn't want to loan money to poor people in the 4th year because 3 years later they would have to cancel the debt. Now the other thing that I want to tell you about this text, which is rather amazing, Hebrew grammar does not have any adverbs. So the way you do an adverb, you repeat the verb. That's called an infinitive absolute. And so if you want to say give, you say give. If you want to say really give, you say give. And so you can't spot that in English translation. But the most amazing thing is that this text has 5 absolute infinitives. It has 5 intensive reinforced verbs. And I do not think that there is any other text in the Old Testament that has 5 of these intensives, which means that it's set up to be the most urgent teaching. And I think that what the Sabbatic principle insists upon is that the economy must be subordinated to the viability of the community. The economy is a subset of the common good and must be made to serve the common good. Now, I'll tell you what I thought when I made this preparation. What I thought was, you know, I know very few of you, but I would imagine that most of you are economically aware. You're not punching the clock and doing all that all the time. So I thought, well, that doesn't really apply to us. So what I thought, if I read you rightly, the part of the Sabbath teaching that pertains to us is the Sabbatic principle, not the first commandments, but the derivative Sabbatic principle. So people like us, as the Sabbath work, have the task of thinking through how does the economy get subordinated to serve the common good. That's what the book of Deuteronomy basically is concerned with. And the Sabbatic principle, as you probably know, is taken one step further with 7 times 7, so that the 50th year is Jubilee in Leviticus 25. This is the extreme expression of Sabbath as 7 times 7. And what that sort of tedious commandment is about is giving the land rest, let it lie fallow. So that's probably an early ecological sensibility. And returning property to people who have lost it in the rough and tumble of the political economy, so that the Jubilee year is back to square one, in which the distribution of property is returned to the way it was in this ideal scheme when everybody in the neighborhood had a piece of it. And as you may know, the word Jubilee comes from the Hebrew word yabal, which means to blow the trumpet. So it is the blowing of the trumpet that signals the performance of this according to this text. So in Leviticus 25, verse 5, there is a provision for complete rest for the land. In verses 6 and 7, complete rest for livestock. Verse 10, to proclaim liberty, liberty from debt. In verse 23, God says, by way of Moses, the land is mine, so it does not belong to the people who are able to buy it up. You don't own it. And in verse 39, it says, you shall not create debt slaves. And verse 42 says, they shall not be sold as slaves. So this is an extraordinary, radical thing, so that forgiveness in the Bible, in the first instant, is economic. It has to do with the forgiveness of debts. And as you may know, in the Lord's Prayer, Presbyterians pray to have our debts forgiven as we forgive our debtors, because most Presbyterians would rather have their debts forgiven than their sins. Now, somebody is going to ask, so I will anticipate evidence that they ever did this, is there? What I find interesting about that question is this text and the text in Deuteronomy 15. These are the only texts I teach about in which people regularly ask that question.